ha hecho de estudio, pero también de activismo en el tema de reformas de política de drogas. Voy a leer brevemente su semblanza, porque además de ser académico en una vida anterior, luego activista, hoy en día es anfitrión de un buenísimo podcast que se llama Psychoactive. Entonces búscanlo y vean los temas de que se habla. Y son con invitados muy especiales en su podcast. Entonces, Ethan Nadelmann es conductor del podcast Psychoactive, así como fundador y exdirector ejecutivo de Drug Policy Alliance, DPA, de Estados Unidos, la principal organización de reforma de políticas de drogas en Estados Unidos. Ethan Nadelmann ha sido descrito por la revista Rolling Stones como el verdadero zar de drogas de Estados Unidos. Ethan es ampliamente reconocido como uno de los principales promotores de las reformas de políticas de drogas, tanto en Estados Unidos como a nivel internacional. Nacido en la ciudad de Nueva York, obtuvo su licenciatura, maestría, doctorado en Derecho y doctorado en Ciencias Políticas en la Universidad de Harvard, enseñó en la Universidad de Princeton y luego fundó y dirigió primero el Lindesmith Center, que se dedicó a estudiar y incidir en las políticas de drogas, y luego el Drug Policy Alliance. También fue cofundador del programa de desarrollo y reducción de daños internacionales del Open Society Institute. Ha escrito varios libros, entre ellos uno sobre la internacionalización del law enforcement que se llama Cops Across Border, y junto con Peter Andreas, Policing the Globe. Ha publicado extensamente en revistas académicas y de difusión sobre el tema de políticas de drogas, tanto en Estados Unidos como a nivel internacional. Y su TED Talk sobre el fin de la guerra contra las drogas tiene más de 2 millones de visualizaciones y ha sido traducido a 28 idiomas. Con esto le voy a dejar con Ethan Nadelmann, que realmente es una de las personas que sabe más y ha estado quizás en más de los esfuerzos y peleas por la regulación de las drogas alrededor del mundo y también en América Latina. Muchas gracias, Ethan, por estar con nosotros. Thanks so much, Ethan, if you're still here.
Yeah, I'm here.
With us. It's a great pleasure and honor to have you. Really one of the principal advocates and also academics who has been involved with drug policy reform and criticizing the war on drugs for such a long time. So we're talking about this briefly. Ethan not only had a frontline seat, but in many cases has been directly involved with many of the changes we have seen in the last couple of years. So thanks so much for being with us.
Jonas, nada más por si tienen dudas, preguntas, que les puedas traducir. Coméntales, por favor.
Sí, si tienen alguna pregunta, comentario y no lo quieren escribir en inglés, yo estoy atento al chat, lo pueden escribir en español, igual en inglés, y yo, para que Ethan no tiene que estar atento al chat, se les voy a pasar cuando hay espacio para preguntas y comentarios. ¿Todo bien? Super.
Okay.
So I'll collect and translate comments and questions for you, so you don't have to look at the chat.
Okay. Ready?
All good.
So first, I apologize that I am not speaking in Spanish. You know, yo estudié español por 4 años cuando yo estaba un niño, y mi padre estaba un ciudadano de Ecuador por la mayor parte de su vida, y yo puedo hablar un poquito en español, especialmente con el sujeto es el problemas de prohibición de drogas, pero yo pienso que yo tengo un defecto de mi cabeza, y yo no puedo entender nada en español. So I have to speak in English, and I will try to speak slowly. And if I'm going too fast, some of you should wave your hands and go slow like this, and I will try to slow down. Okay. As Jonas said, I have been involved with the issue of drugs and drug policy for 40 years. I mean, longer if, if I go back to when I first started smoking marijuana in 1975, when I started college. But in terms of studying, I began to study the drug issue really 40 years ago in 1983, when almost nobody was talking or thinking about drugs. Almost nobody in academia, certainly nobody, almost nobody in the field of political science or international relations. There were some, sociologists, criminologists who were doing it. But 40 years ago, there had been the excitement in the, back in the late 1960s, early 1970s, when drug use became, both popular among young people, marijuana, psychedelics, when we had perhaps the second wave of our heroin problems in America, then Richard Nixon opportunistically declaring war on drugs in the early 70s. Then there was in the mid 1970s and the late 1970s, during the era of President Jimmy Carter, there was a sort of wave of liberalization. And at this point, I was still just a teenager. But that was a period in the United States when 11 of our 50 states passed laws to decriminalize, not legalize, but to decriminalize, to reduce the penalties on possession of cannabis, of marijuana. When President Carter, came out in support of the federal, decriminalizing marijuana possession at the federal level, there was the early thinking in favor of some drug policy reforms, and there was the beginning of an advocacy movement, the creation of an organization called NORML, NORML, which advocated for the legal decriminalization and legalization of marijuana. But by the 1980s, things had become very quiet, and the country. I'm going to speak mostly about the United States, but also about Latin America and the rest of the globe. And I decided, I was, in graduate school at Harvard. My interest had been American foreign policy in the Middle East, but I was looking for something new. And I'd always been interested in drugs and deviant behavior and all this, and was not taking my professional career very seriously, because if I was, I would never have decided to focus on drugs. But I decided that I would write my dissertation on this issue. And people thought I was silly and not serious to focus on this issue. The country was becoming conservative. Ronald Reagan was beginning to launch a war on drugs, but it was still even before that time. The Democrats were concerned about rising levels of crime. So, there wasn't much interest. And I began to study this issue. And I knew that there was something fundamentally wrong with the prohibitionist drug war policy. And I knew, as somebody who was a regular, consumed marijuana, that all the rhetoric and hysteria was ridiculous. But I began to read about the drug issue. And simultaneously, one of my professors suggested to me that I, instead of writing, I thought I would write a diplomatic history of US international drug policy. But one of my professors who had worked, he was a professor at Harvard Law School. He had worked in the Justice Department. He said, why don't you focus on the subject of the internationalization of criminal law enforcement, which at that point was mostly about drug policy. And if you think about it, it's the area that lay at the intersection of criminal justice and foreign policy, or from another perspective, at the intersection of international relations and criminology. And I said, okay, I'll focus there. And what I was fascinated by was that as one began to delve into this intersection, you realize that there was remarkably little scholarship in that area. Almost no academics, no lawyers, almost nobody studying that issue. Yet at the same time, you had, the Attorney General of the United States, a few years later, saying that sometimes 50% of his week would be devoted to international criminal justice issues, right? And I knew historically it had been, under Richard Nixon, the United States had shut down the border with Mexico back in the early 70s. I mean, I knew this issue was significant. So I began to study that issue and began to interview people in the government. And I was interviewing somebody in the State Department in 1984. And he says to me, if you really want to understand how this works, you have to come work in the government. And how do I do that? And well, what happened was he introduced me to the person who was in charge of the State Department's Narcotics Bureau. It was then called INM, International Narcotics Matters, a guy named John Thomas, who had previously worked in the CIA. And he was now running the State Department's Narcotics Bureau. And I went to meet him. And he said, well, I think, we were beginning to get interested in this issue of money laundering and drugs. So I need you to write a report about drug-related money laundering, but you need to get a security clearance. So I went, I got a security clearance. That was its own funny story because, the person from the US government asked me about, have I ever smoked marijuana? And I say, yes. And he said, how many times? And I say, well, probably a few hundred. I lost count. And then he says, have you ever tried other drugs? And I say, I tried cocaine. I didn't really like it. What else? I said, well, mushrooms, psilocybin mushrooms. He said, how many times? I said, I don't know, 10 or 12. And he goes, what was that like? And so I start to tell him about psilocybin psychedelic mushrooms. And then the interview ended. And he says to me, let me give you a piece of advice. If you have another interview for top secret clearance. What's that? I say. He said, well, if he asks you about mushrooms, don't smile so much when you tell him what they are. Okay. But nonetheless, I got the security clearance. I went to work in the State Department's Narcotics Bureau. I wrote a classified report on drug-related money laundering. I would hang out in the State Department each night when everybody was gone and go through all the files to see what was interesting there. And interestingly, there was very little in the files that you could not read in the newspapers. And simultaneously, I began interviewing law enforcement agents, not just for the report, but for my dissertation, my PhD dissertation on the internationalization of criminal law enforcement. And I landed up traveling all around Latin America and Europe to 19 different countries in Latin America and Europe, interviewing agents of the US Drug Enforcement Administration and Customs, and sometimes FBI, and a couple of CIA, and then people in the State Department. And then I would interview the local in the countries. I would interview the people who were running the drug enforcement operations in the country, in Latin America or Europe. And I ended up interviewing about 200 law enforcement agents, including about 60 or 70 US DEA agents. And it got to the point where I knew more about how the DEA was operating around the world than most of the agents, because I was finding myself telling agents in one country how agents in other countries did it. So I became very knowledgeable, and I ended up writing a dissertation and a book called Cops Across Borders, as Jonas mentioned, about the internationalization of criminal law enforcement. And then another book called Policing the Globe with a professor, with somebody who was a professor at Brown, Peter Andreas. But the truth was, as I'm working on that, it's interesting, but my heart's not in it, because I'm studying how police agents and prosecutors and diplomats deal with the internationalization of crime and the internationalization of the drug war. But meanwhile, my belief is that the entire drug war is bullshit. It's not grounded in science or economics or any kind of, critical analytical thinking. It was a case of the policy being driven by the rhetoric rather than the other way around. And as I'm finishing my dissertation at Harvard in 1986, all of a sudden, the United States is going crazy about drugs. It's the emergence of crack cocaine, and we have very high levels of crime in the United States, and some of that is connected to the markets with crack cocaine and, problems in the inner cities in America with incredibly high low. I mean, if you think about it, this year, or last year in New York City, there's maybe going to be 350 or 400 homicides. Back in 1989-90, there were over 2,000 homicides, and a majority of them were involving battles between people over drugs and drug trafficking and you name it, right? I mean, it was a really serious crime problem, and the drugs and drug war were playing a big role. And it seemed to me that our entire approach was just crazy. And so, so I'm thinking about this, and then I gave my first talk about drug policy. The U.S. Information Agency invited me to give a talk at a conference at the University de los Andes in Bogota. And I went down there in 1986. I remember it was my 29th birthday. I gave a talk there, and then I gave a talk to the U.S. Embassy. And I basically said, this is, ridiculous. And that was the last time the U.S. Information Agency ever invited me to give a talk. And then in 1987, I give another talk at a meeting of U.S. intelligence analysts, and everybody's like gearing up. It's just, these are intelligence analysts, but they're all in this hysterical drug war, mindset. And then as I'm leaving, I go to teach at Princeton University in 1987. And in the spring of 1988, I publish an article called, in a prestigious U.S. journal called Foreign Policy Magazine. And in it, I basically say that most of what we identify as part and parcel of the drug problem are in fact a result of a failed prohibitionist policy, right? That drug abuse is a serious issue, but that most of the solution should focus on the health side, whereas most of the problems, the crime, the violence, the corruption, the black markets, the exploding prison populations, the growing empowerment of criminal organizations in the United States and in the Caribbean and Latin America and other parts of the world, that these are all problems of prohibition, not unlike the problems we had with alcohol prohibition in the United States. There was a real problem with alcohol abuse in the US, but Al Capone and the rising levels of crime and violence and corruption and the overflowing jail cells and young people looking at, bootleggers, alcohol, as role models, all of this, the declining respect for law and order, the corruption of politicians, these were all not the results of drugs per se, but of a failed prohibitionist policy that was doomed to failure because no amount of prohibition could succeed in truly suppressing the market for a highly popular psychoactive commodity. So I published this article in Foreign Policy Magazine, and a few weeks later, two things happened. The very prestigious British magazine, The Economist, comes out publicly for the first time and says more or less the same thing. And then a politician in Baltimore, Kurt Schmoke, he had been the chief prosecutor, elected mayor, a black man, but with a Harvard, Yale, prestigious education. He gives a speech at a conference of mayors and police chiefs. And he more or less says the same thing. And I remember it was late April 1988. This was before cell phones or anything. I'm actually down in Mexico City at a conference at the Colegio de Mexico on transnational crime and law enforcement. And I get back home and my answering machine has all these messages. And one of them is an invitation to appear on what was then the most prestigious news program in America called Nightline. And so all of a sudden, I'm on Nightline with the mayor of Baltimore I just told you about, and the head of the congressional committee who was most opposed to what we stood for. And I don't know if you know the expression in Mexico or in Spanish, 15 minutes of fame. I think it's an Andy Warhol expression. It's when all of a sudden, you know, somebody who's not known explodes into the popular eye for quote unquote 15 minutes, right? But that's what happened. All of a sudden, I'm a young 31-year-old professor and I'm on all the national TV programs and I'm doing interviews and national TV and the major news magazines and, you know, you name it. And the same thing is happening outside the United States as well to some extent. Right. And I'm on the phone giving interviews to journalists and, you know, and I'm not saying that we should legalize all drugs. I am saying we should talk about legalizing marijuana, but that also we need a public health approach with these other drugs. But at that point, the debate was very crude. It was either you're for the drug war or you're for legalization, and there was nothing in the middle. And so, you know, meanwhile, at the same time, there's an organization emerging called the Drug Policy Foundation, created by a professor named Arnold Trebach and an activist named Kevin Zeese. And they present themselves and they call themselves the loyal opposition to the war on drugs, right? The loyal opposition to the war on drugs. And I become involved with this organization. And I also create a working group at Princeton University of leading academics to think through what would be the best way to control drugs, to regulate drugs. You know, and we look, for example, at what was the thinking that happened when back in 1932 and 1933, as public opinion in America turned against alcohol prohibition, and people began to think what would be the best way to regulate drugs in a responsible way, to both minimize the negative consequences of prohibition and to minimize the negative consequences of alcohol abuse. So I'm creating this working group and I'm still out there speaking and writing and teaching at the Princeton on this thing and becoming involved in the beginnings of an emerging activist movement. I'm also going down to Mexico occasionally and to Colombia, especially Los Andes, down to Peru occasionally, and countries in Europe, speaking about what's wrong with drug policy and why the prohibitionist approach is wrong. And I'm also encouraging people to look at Europe, because in Europe, two things had emerged in Europe that were very interesting, right? One was that going back in the late 1970s, the mid 1970s, the Dutch, the Netherlands, had decriminalized the possession of marijuana and even decriminalized the low-level sale. And they had tolerated the emergence of what were known as coffee shops, right? Which were technically illegal, but which the government essentially allowed to buy marijuana in small amounts and to sell to other people, a kind of mom and pop small store. And that was a very successful approach, where when they did that, cannabis use did not increase, and there was very little criminality involved in the early years. And then the other thing that was interesting was that as people began to realize that HIV and AIDS were spreading among and by people who were injecting drugs, and spreading not because drugs caused AIDS and not because needles caused AIDS, but because if somebody was infected and they shared a needle with somebody else, they could transmit the disease that way. So you had the emergence of what was called the harm reduction approach, which really begins as as needle exchange, right? I mean, the origins of harm reduction are really 40 years ago, and it's in the Netherlands and the United Kingdom and then other countries, really talking about, yes, we want people to stop using drugs, but the most important thing is to stop people spreading and getting HIV and AIDS, because we have no cure for that. And it's basically a death sentence for most people. So let's focus on reducing the spread of HIV AIDS, even if that means we have to treat the fight against drugs as a second priority. Remarkably, in 1985, the very conservative Prime Minister of Britain, Margaret Thatcher, basically comes out in favor of harm reduction, right? In favor of needle exchange, even though she's yelling and screaming for the drug war and doing all this US type stuff, her government basically embraces a policy of supporting needle exchange. And you see that happening in the Netherlands, and then you see it happening in Germany, and you see it happening in Switzerland, and then Australia, and a little bit in Canada, and beginning to pop up in the United States. So you're seeing this harm reduction policy. And so, I'm out there speaking and lecturing, and, we have meanwhile, in the United States, the prison population, if you think about it, in 1980, the prison population, our prison population, prison and jail, is basically kind of like typical, like we're at the average of the world, right? And we have 500,000 people behind bars in the United States out of a population of a little bit under 270, 280 million, whatever. And of that 500,000, 50,000 are there for violating a drug law. By the time we get to the late 1990s and early 2000s, the number of people incarcerated in American prisons and jails, in the United States, if you're in a federal or state prison, if you're incarcerated for more than a year by the federal government or state government, we call that prison. If you're incarcerated in a local jail for less than a year, we call that jail. So in the United States, roughly 2/3 of all the people are in federal state prisons and 1/3 are in local jails. Just so that's a little detail, but important in the American context. What happens is that the number of people incarcerated in the United States increases from 500,000 in 1980 to over 2 million, up to 2.3 million by the early 2000s. The number of people locked up on a drug charge, so that's over a 4-fold increase, right? The number of people locked up on a drug charge goes from 50,000 to 500,000, a 10-fold increase. And then if you add on to that, the number of people who are basically on parole or probation, in other words, living in the community, but where they're being under criminal justice surveillance, and they're getting locked up for violating parole or probation with a drug offense, add on hundreds more thousands. And then if you take the people who are getting arrested for prostitution or petty crimes of theft because they have a drug habit, that's hundreds of thousands more. And then if you take the people going to prison because they're involved in drug dealing and because they're involved in violent altercations, because they're trying to, protect their drug market or compete with other drug dealers or, punish people who have not made good on a deal, that when you look at that 2.3 million people locked up in America, if you add it all up, it's like half or more are in some way connected to the drug war. The United States, with 5% of the world's population, had more than 25% of the world's incarcerated population, right? Incredible. It was the highest rate of incarceration in the world. The Russians are in second place, huffing and puffing, but they can't catch up with us, right? We had more people locked up in our prisons than China, and China had 5 times our population, right? We had the highest percentage of our population locked up in the history of democratic countries. the rate of incarceration of Black people in America was dramatically higher than the rate of incarceration of Black people in apartheid South Africa, right? Astronomical. So when I would hear people in Mexico or Colombia or other people who were complaining about the United States banging and beating up on Mexico or Colombia or other countries, and they would say, why don't you crack down in your own country? I would say, shut the hell up. You have no idea how America is cracking down in our own country. You have no idea the rates of incarceration. I'm sorry that my government is doing these stupid ass policies to your countries. I apologize as an American, but don't tell us to crack down more in our own country. You might tell us to get smarter about drug policy, but not to get tougher, because basically no democratic country has ever been as tough as the United States was in all these decades, right? So, there's so to shift back, there's the emergence of a drug policy reform movement, but meanwhile, we're tiny. I mean, we have almost no impact at all. And so I'm just a professor at Princeton speaking and writing and trying to help in the reform movement. And then a very lucky thing happened for me and for the movement, which is I get this invitation in the summer of 1992, right? I've been out there for 4 or 5 years, and I get an invitation inviting me to lunch with a guy named George Soros. And I don't know how many of you have heard of Soros now. He's known as a very famous philanthropist. He's also seen as politically on the left. He's demonized by all the people in America who are on the right. He's demonized by, the kind of authoritarian figures around the world, from Putin to Orban in Hungary, to the government of Poland, he's now a kind of hated figure by the right wing around the world, right? Back then, his politics were not all that left. He was sort of politically centrist, but he had been the principal philanthropist in the 1980s, funding the movement in Eastern Europe to bring down communist socialist dictatorship. And then it had fallen very quickly. Nobody expected the Soviet Union to come crumbling down. I mean, if anybody had told you in 1985, the Soviet Union is going to come crumbling down into a dozen different countries and there'll be no more Soviet Union, you would have thought they were smoking some weird drug, right? I mean, if you had told them that the Soviet bloc and communist Europe would come crumbling down, nobody would have believed you. I mean, it would be like saying today that, China is going to become a democratic country in 10 years. I mean, nobody would believe you, right? I mean, it just seemed preposterous. But in fact, that's what happened back then. I mean, I think for you all who are young, you cannot believe how extraordinary it was to see the crumbling of socialist dictatorship in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. And Soros who had been growing up in Hungary as a Jew, and he had survived and left and moved to the West. I mean, he had been the principal philanthropist supporting this downfall of socialist dictatorship. And when it succeeded faster and better than anybody succeeded, he asked himself the question, well, I always assumed that the United States was the model of the open society, of an open society, of a free democratic society, based upon the principles of the philosopher Karl Popper. But where is it not? And the first thing that hit Soros between the eyes was the drug war, right? That the drug war was like socialist dictatorship. I mean, it was authoritarian. The government did not really, all the scientific funding was politicized. It relied on informants and undercover operations and wiretapping. It was anti-free market. It was all about control. It was based upon lies and rhetoric. And so he had invited me to lunch because I was then the most prominent person, not just in the US, but around the world, speaking and writing about this. And we had a very nice lunch. And at the end of it, Soros says, well, I think we basically agree. I mean, I was teaching him about harm reduction and other things. And, after a year later, we shook hands on an agreement. I wanted him to fund this organization, Drug Policy Foundation. I wanted him to help me set up a grants program. And I wanted him to help me fund an interdisciplinary center on drugs and drug policy, like you have to some extent in Aguascalientes now, but to do one in the US. And he said yes. And then he said a few months later, actually, forget about the university. I'm starting a new foundation. I want your drug policy project to be the first project in my new foundation. And so I said, okay. And so in 1994, I left the university and started this project. And mostly it was sort of an academic project. There was still almost no opportunity to do anything political, right? But then what happened was some opportunities began to emerge. You know, I was meeting a few other very wealthy men in the United States, some other billionaires. All of them, they were all politically a little more to the left than to the right, but they were the heads of major companies. One was the for-profit university, University of Phoenix. Another was the second biggest insurance company, Progressive Insurance. Another was the head of the guy who had built the biggest men's retail clothing company called the Men's Warehouse. And I had met each of these guys individually, and they were each wanting to do more. And meanwhile, there were some activists beginning to do things. There were some activists beginning to do needle exchange, activists beginning to do medical marijuana, activists beginning, little stuff. And with Soros's money, we were beginning to fund some of these groups. And in California, some local activists who had before worked on the AIDS issue, they had written a draft ballot in the United States. Half of our 50 states, in all 50 states, you can change laws through the legislature. But in half of the states, mostly in the West, but not only, you can also collect signatures, draft a law, and put it on the ballot for the citizens to vote, what we call the ballot initiative process, right? And so these local activists had drafted a law to legalize marijuana for medical purposes. And they had no money, they had no anything, no ability to run a statewide campaign. And so I received a call and I decided to help them. And I was able to pull together the billionaires, Soros and Lewis, these rich guys, and even one Lawrence Rockefeller, one of the famous Rockefellers, and some others, and to basically put this initiative to legalize medical marijuana on the ballot in California in 1996. And we also had an initiative in Arizona to require treatment instead of incarceration for people who had been caught in possession of drugs. And lo and behold, on Election Day 1996, we won. And it was front page news around America. The initiative in California and the one in Arizona, they got more votes than Bill Clinton did in his re-election campaign. And he did very well in California. I mean, it was a remarkable victory. The way I described it, it was the first time that this nascent, this newborn drug policy reform movement showed that we could play ball. This is an American expression. It's where we showed that we could play ball in the big leagues of American politics. In other words, that we could win in the big time, not just the lower leagues, right? And it showed that we were serious. It showed that we could really play real politics. We could change real laws. And it was a major breakthrough, right? And then a couple years later, I was able to put together the funding and the campaigns. And we went to Alaska and Oregon and Washington and Colorado and Nevada and Maine. And we won more ballot initiatives to legalize medical marijuana. And then we won another initiative in California in 2000, basically to require treatment instead of incarceration. And then we won two more initiatives in Oregon and Utah that basically to stop the practice whereby the police were allowed to seize people's property and cars and keep it, even, for their own departments, what we call asset forfeiture, without having to have a criminal conviction, right? It was another important issue that brought together the left and the right. So we were really gaining serious momentum on this stuff in the United States. And then a few things happened. One, from an organizational perspective, my work was very successful. We were building a movement. I was the principal gatekeeper for most of the funding going on around the United States for drug policy reform. I'd also been successful in getting Soros to start an international harm reduction development program. So we were now funding programs for needle exchange and methadone reform and harm reduction in the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, right? And beginning to make a few grants outside the United States, right? But all of this was creating a dynamic where the people in Soros's foundation were getting more comfortable to have me out of the house. So I left Soros's foundation and merged my organization with that organization I told you about, the Drug Policy Foundation, which had fallen on hard times. And we created what's now called the Drug Policy Alliance. And so, you know, I basically spent the next years building up this Drug Policy Alliance into what became the leading organization, not just in the United States, but in the world, you know, basically working to end the drug war and really focusing on three major issues. 1/3 of our work was on legalizing marijuana, first for medical purposes, and decriminalizing possession, and reducing the racially biased marijuana arrest, and ultimately legalizing marijuana in a responsible way, right? And the second third of the work was on ending the role of the drug war in mass incarceration in the United States. And the last third of the work was making a major commitment to treating drug use and addiction as a health issue, not a criminal issue, which meant legal access to needles to reduce the spread of AIDS. It meant overdose reduction programs. It meant a sex education model to drug education. It meant educating Americans about the innovations that were happening in Europe and some other countries in terms of harm reduction, not just needle exchange, but what are called safe injection sites, or prescribing pharmaceutical heroin to heroin addicts who were going to the streets, right? So we began building this up and doing public education and doing cases in the courts and also doing, you know, legislative work, you know, at the state legislature and beginning to mobilize in the US Congress and slowly basically popping holes in the kind of broader prohibitionist edifice. Now, there was, it's important to realize, a strategic sensibility behind all this, right? And so when I decided to focus on the issue of medical marijuana, we did it for two reasons. One was basically a moral belief that those marijuana users who were really using marijuana for medical purposes, that they had a moral right to be the first in line to not be treated as criminals anymore. But the second reason we focused on medical marijuana was because we believed, and were later proven right, that by starting a debate on medical marijuana and by legalizing medical marijuana in a growing number of the US states, that we could transform the public dialogue around marijuana. That the media, before, whenever we would talk about marijuana decriminalization, the media would instantly show people smoking joints. They would show a picture of some, you know, 17-year-old high school dropout, you know, with hemp leaves and his blonde dreadlocks, and that would be the picture of marijuana. But once we started to work on medical marijuana, they would shift to showing an older person, a woman who was having chemotherapy for breast cancer and using marijuana to deal with the nausea, or a man who was dealing with multiple sclerosis and the marijuana helped reduce the pain and the tremors, right? We humanize that. Or to take another example, when we focused on the issue of needle exchange programs, we did it for two reasons, like with medical marijuana. One was because the evidence showed that by making sterile needles available to injecting drug users, you would reduce the spread of HIV/AIDS and Hep C and other infectious diseases without increasing drug use in the broader society. But the second reason was that by focusing on needle exchange and creating safe places where people who were illegal drug injectors could go to exchange needles and maybe get some services, we were basically transforming the injecting drug user from a deviant criminal who deserved to be ostracized and persecuted and prosecuted into a potential partner in a public health campaign to reduce the spread of a deadly disease for which we had no cure, right? So think of, we were thinking about this strategically and in the long term. It's the same way when we began to have some success in rolling back, in reducing the very harsh criminal penalties on people who possessed and sold drugs. You know, there would sometimes be a debate between the incrementalist approach and the more radical approach. Well, most of us had a fairly radical objective. We wanted to end the prohibition, or we wanted to end, you know, the mandatory minimum drug law. But there'd be a debate if all you can get is 20 or 30% of what you want this time around. Do you take that compromise? Or do you say no in the hope that you'll get a better deal next year? And what I learned over time is 8 or 9 times out of 10, it's better to take the small piece, to take the 20 or 30%, especially if you're able to lay the groundwork for going to the next stage in future years. So if you can take the 20 or 30%, if you can get the incrementalist victory, and at the same time secure commitment from your allies and even some of your opponents, that they understand there's still more to be done, that you're more likely to ultimately accomplish your ultimate objective by embracing the incremental reforms now and setting the stage for more substantial reforms down the road, right? So, you know, what I can say is that, I mean, I want to now condense this so I can talk about the international side. But what happened in the following years was that, you know, in the United States, it's not all moving forward, because what happened in, you know, I remember on election day 2000, not only did we win some of the medical marijuana victories and the victories on the ballot initiatives on reforming the asset forfeiture laws, but we also won this treatment instead of incarceration initiative, which was basically the biggest reform of criminal sentencing laws since the repeal of alcohol prohibition in 1933. But it should have gotten the headlines the next day. But you know what the headline was? Election undecided in Florida. Bush v. Gore. Nobody knows who won the election of 2000 because some weird stuff has happened in Florida and we cannot declare a victor. And so the media was not, you know, so we lost the national excitement around that. And then Bush becomes president. And then the Republicans take back one house of Congress. And then 9/11, September 11th happens in 2001, and the whole country goes into a more conservative, security, fearful mindset. And then in 2000, the Republicans win both houses of Congress. And so, you know, it's not all moving forward. We had this wonderful momentum between 1996 and 2000, and then it was moving backwards. And that's the period where you learn you have to dig in. You have to plan for the long term. I was learning how to build and run a bigger organization. It's where we're giving out grants, $1 million of grants to different organizations to, you know, begin to build up the activist, you know, stuff, you know, all of this stuff, right? So now, mind you, then things change. In 2006, the Democrats take back the House of Representatives. In 2008, you know, Barack Obama wins the presidency. Probably the proudest moment of my life as an American was the election of 2008, when, you know, America elected a black man named Barack Hussein Obama to become our president. Most people did not believe that was possible, but it happened, and it happened in a big way. And then we reelected him 4 years later. And so things begin to open up. We're winning more and more states and cities are allowing needle exchange and supporting harm reduction. You know, we also begin to have the ballot initiatives to legalize begin that initiative, people are saying, it'll never have a chance to win. You get to November of 2010, and we lost by a few points, but the media is saying, how come you didn't win? It was one of the few situations where we lost a ballot initiative, but I think we actually moved forward because it transformed the national discussion, right? Transformed the national discussion, right? And then in 2012, we win in Colorado and Washington. And there were many other people. It's not just me. I mean, with Colorado and Washington, my role and my organization was to provide help funding and drafting, but we were not taking the lead. There were other organizations, national and state, that were doing this. The movement is growing bigger, right? And then in 2014, we win 2 more states, Alaska and Oregon, plus Washington, D.C. So we show that this is real. It's not just a fluke. And then in 2016, we legalized marijuana in California and in Massachusetts and in Maine and in Nevada, right? And we show that, at that point, we recognize that the legalization of marijuana is essentially inevitable. Now, there are some people who support drug policy reform who resent the focus on marijuana, and they're worried. And they say you're focusing on this, but you're not paying attention to the other parts of the drug war. Or by legalizing marijuana, you're gonna take the easy part, and now the whole drug war will focus on the people using heroin and cocaine and selling those drugs. But essentially, it turns out, I think we were right. They were wrong, right? That what happens is, as we build momentum on legalizing marijuana, the media doesn't just say marijuana being legalized, they say momentum going to end the drug war. People see the legalization of marijuana as a broader vote against the drug war and for bigger alternative drug policies. So it's not that the legalization of marijuana is taking away from the other stuff. In fact, there's a synergistic effect where it's helping that. And I can also tell you, I'm kind of the leading fundraiser for drug policy reform in America until I stopped running Drug Policy Alliance 6 years ago. And I can tell you, I'm raising money because of all the excitement around legalizing marijuana, but I'm quietly actually using some of that money to support harm reduction and broader drug policy reform for the issues that are less popular with the public and less popular with the funders. Right? So, it's a kind of complicated and multidimensional strategy, right? And it's also, by the way, one of, being very conscious about the strategies and the language we're using. It was very important for me that even though my own personal politics were left of center, and most of the people working in my organization were young people whose politics were even more left of center than my own, it was always important that in our advocacy and in our communication, we would use tactics and language that would also bring in people from the right wing, from the conservative part of the political spectrum. The message I would oftentimes put out is that we drug policy reformers do not win unless the ordinary American parent believes that our argument is more compelling than the argument of the drug warriors. That we had to frame our argument not in terms of what would appeal to the left or appeal to the drug users or whatever. We had to frame our argument in terms of what was going to be persuasive to the average, ordinary, middle-class parent who worried about their kids, worried about drugs. Maybe they used marijuana when they were younger, but they probably weren't anymore. We had to frame our message in a way that was going to appeal to them and be more persuasive than the drug warriors' message, right? It meant that the people, the spokespeople, had to be people who would appeal to them. It meant the language we used. And I could speak about this for hours and hours, but it meant paying attention to that stuff. It's oftentimes, I think, a fundamental failing with respect to mobilization. I see this because I'm much closer to stuff on the left than the right, and it's something I despair about now, how much advocacy is happening on the left where people seem indifferent to the language, where they're using language and words and phrases, that most of the country doesn't even understand, doesn't even know. It's all about identity politics. It's not about building alliances where we can win in the country. It's about building alliances in a few left liberal states like California, New York, and a few others. It's all about putting one's favored way of expressing oneself, rather than focusing on what will move it. I oftentimes say when I'm giving, speeches to activists, that many activists think that the nature of activism is speaking your truth. And my view on that is, no, that's ridiculous. Yes, you want to articulate on some level your truth, but you want to use the words and the language that will be accessible and understandable to the people who don't initially agree with your truth, right? I mean, if the word legalize marijuana is the one most, I'll use, but if you believe that legalize is not the right language, then you use the words tax, control, regulate, and educate. You use the words end prohibition. You use another language. If in fact, if the most effective language for ending the drug war were that would be the language I would use. It would be whatever language is going to be most persuasive to advance the values and policies that I believe in and that I know are grounded in science and health and compassion and human rights, right? That's the nature of activism. And it's a message, when activists forget that, I think in most cases, they're doomed to failure, or they're doomed to having victories only in those jurisdictions where the politics already favor them, but not in the majority of jurisdictions, right? Okay, so now let me just talk about the international side of things. Most of my organization was focused 90% on the United States and much of the funding. But my personal perspective, I became interested in this drug issue, as I said at the beginning, from an international perspective, from a foreign policy perspective. I was always, as or more interested in what was going on in international relations in Latin America and Europe and the rest of the world. And then I had to learn all the US stuff after that. And perhaps fortuitously, George Soros, who, was my primary donor in the 1990s and remained my largest donor, even though he was only 1/3 by the end, he also came to this perspective, from an international perspective. So for me, it was always very important to keep writing and speaking about this issue. And so, I was landed up speaking and testifying in this, not just in 40 states out of the 50 in the US, but also in 40 countries around the world. And in almost, most of the countries in South America, from, Colombia and Peru and Argentina and Chile and Paraguay, and Paraguay and Panama and Guatemala and Mexico and the Caribbean, that was important to me, that we had to, when I would go there, I go and speak in these countries, the first thing I would say is, by the way, just a quick question. Did any of you have a chance to watch my TED Talk? Just raise your hands. Did you have a chance to watch the TED Talk? Well, if you do, go and watch the TED Talk. And it's with Spanish. For those of you, there's also with Spanish subtitles. You can watch that. Just Google TED Talk and watch it. Because it's a 15-minute talk, and it's a good summary of the basic critique of drug prohibition. And I think you'll enjoy it. It was actually a talk I gave in Rio de Janeiro back in 2014. But so I would begin by apologizing in American for the incredible harm that my government was doing around the world with its drug war. And then the second thing I would say, and I would point out the ways in which so many of the problems in Mexico, Colombia, and many other countries around the world were in fact the fact that these countries were caught between a rock and a hard place. Caught on the one hand between immense US pressure and threats to keep conforming to the drug war, but on the other hand, a very dynamic global commodities market that could not effectively be suppressed. But the third thing I would say is that, you know, so many people in Mexico, Colombia, and other countries, you know, they believe that the US war on drugs was not really about drugs. They believe it's just an excuse for the US to advance ulterior national security and economic and political and economic interests. And that it wasn't really about drugs. It was about, you know, trying to humiliate Mexico or trying to advance a more militaristic policy in Latin America or whatever. And what I would say is, sorry, that's not true. That's not what it's about. In point of fact, I mean, from a US perspective, you know, we don't have an interest, the United States, in narco traffickers becoming dominant, figures, political figures in substantial parts of Mexico, Colombia, Bolivia, I mean, Peru, you name it. We don't have an interest in this type of instability.
Vamos a ver si regresa.
Incluso se salió.
Bueno, ¿qué tal si hacemos una pausa de 5 minutos?
Ya está aquí Ethan de nuevo.
I'm back.
Está aquí. Ok.
I'm back.
Ajá.
Sí.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, so basically, I'd point out that that paradoxically, the United States, that the best way to understand the U.S. drug policy is that, we were crazy about drugs. And the way to understand the United States international drug policy is not as a rational policy or as an ulterior way of advancing our security and political and other interests, but it makes more sense to understand U.S. international drug policy as the international projection of a domestic psychosis. In other words, we really are crazy about drugs. And that's why the United States drug policy is effectively undermining our other broader interests, right? Now, for me, what was interesting in Latin America was, in the United States, it was an interesting contrast there. In the United States, most of the success was we were going to the public. We were looking at the issues where the public was ahead of the politicians on rolling back truck penalties, on legalizing medical marijuana more broadly. And we were then taking advantage of the ballot initiative process. For us, although we would have a few politicians who are allies, it was going to the public, doing these ballot initiatives, winning them at the ballot box, and then eventually the politicians would follow and the elites would follow. Almost no members of Congress, and certainly no members of the US Senate, were in favor of legalizing marijuana until just a few years ago, right? Because they're afraid of their shadow on this issue, right? Now, interestingly, the opposite was true in most of Latin America. In much of Latin America, I would talk with the elites, and both elites from the left and the right? And oftentimes the elites in academia, in politics, right? They would understand the argument for ending prohibition. They would understand why the US drug war and prohibition was counterproductive for their countries, right? But at the popular level, you had tremendous resistance to drug reform, in part because of very substantial populations that were Catholic and evangelical. When you would do a public opinion poll in Mexico or Colombia or Brazil or other countries, you'd find very little support until a few years ago for legalizing marijuana, even for medical purposes or more broadly, right? There wasn't that type of popular support. People did not like the US drug war, but they did not like, they did not like the notion of liberalization either, right? And so, and it was quite frustrating. But one of the and so if you go back to the late 80s and the 90s, there were always Latin American politicians on the left and the right who supported the idea of legalization or ending the drug war, right? You especially saw this in Colombia, right? In the early 2000s, the support begins to grow on that. And then I wrote an article that was another article in Foreign Policy magazine in 2007. That was on the cover of the magazine. And it basically made the argument, once again, against the drug war and rethinking about prohibition and legalization. And I made a proposal that there should be a commission created, of elites, because what you had is many of the elites, they would not come out publicly, but for everyone who spoke publicly in favor of legalization or decriminalization, you knew it was just the tip of the iceberg, right? So in 2008, a new commission emerges, headed by the Mexican president Zedillo, the former Mexican president Zedillo, the former Colombian president Cesar Gaviria, and the former Brazilian president Fernando Henrique Cardoso. And they create a Latin American Commission on Drugs and Democracy. And in 2009, they come out with a report basically saying, we need to head in a different direction. We need to consider harm reduction, other alternatives, but they're very cautious. And then in 2010, there's a decision to expand this commission into a global commission on drug policy. If you Google Global Commission on Drug Policy, GCDP, you'll find it. And they add on other members from Latin America and also members from Europe and some other parts of the world, right? Including the former president of Switzerland, Ruth Dreyfus, and the former head of the European Union, or a former prime minister of Portugal, and a former and the current prime minister of Greece, Papandreou, and the former head of the United Nations, Kofi Annan, and the former president of Nigeria, Obasanjo, and a whole bunch of others, right? Come on board this thing, and that commission begins to speak out, publicly, and gradually becomes more radical, and ultimately lands up, calling for actually the legal regulation of all drugs, right? And I'm playing a role as advisor to the commission. Steve Rolls is playing a role as advisor to the commission, right? And they're really becoming more and more bold on this thing. It's funny, I'll tell you, Zedillo initially is very cautious on this thing. And then there's a moment, and you'd probably be pissed off if you told him I told you this, but even when there's the first meeting, he doesn't even want to be in the photographs with the other guys. But then in 2011 or 12, he decides he's in. And at that point, he goes from being the more cautious member of the commission to being one of the most radical and impatient members of the commission, right? So that was a step forward there. Right now, the other thing that happens in 2012, and this was very interesting for me, you have in Mexico, MUCAD, right? Mexicanos Unida contra la Delincuencia, with Armando Santa Cruz playing an important role, an affluent businessman who's actually doing a very American style thing where he and some other businessmen are donating money for policy advocacy. You almost never see Latin American philanthropists, or even for that matter, European philanthropists, giving personal money to advocate for policy reform. But Armando Santa Cruz is playing a really important, role in this thing, right? And then, and he's organizing a conference in Mexico in early 2012. And simultaneously, there had been an election in Guatemala. And a right-wing military general, Otto Perez Molina, had been elected. Now, interestingly, Otto Perez had come to see me in New York 4 years earlier, the first time he ran. And I had talked to him about how crazy the drug war was, and you need to move in this direction. and he, he thought I was, I don't know what he thought, but anyway, he gets elected, and he was a right-wing military general, but he had also been given credit for preventing a coup by the military a few years earlier. And he was also seen as somebody who was smart from a policy perspective, right? And he all of a sudden gives a speech saying we need to consider legalizing drugs, right? And meanwhile, in Colombia, the Colombian president Santos, who had been Uribe's, vice president and had been, kind of pro-drug war. But I knew that back in 1998, he had signed a public letter that I had written to the Secretary General back in 1998. And I knew he was sympathetic to reform. And he's beginning to kind of put his foot in the water. And so I tell you, I had this fascinating week in early 2012. And I go down to Mexico for the conference that MUCAD is, doing in Mexico City. And they got generals, they got the first lady of Mexico. And I land up, I go and have a meeting with your president. What's his name? The guy who headed the drug war back then. Jonas, the president.
2012 should still be Calderon.
So I get a meeting with Calderon, and it was just me. And I go into Mexico, the presidential palace with Calderon, and he's got two of his ministers there too, the Minister of Finance and another one, right? And I spend an hour there. And I had seen that Calderon, I mean, here he is, the champion of the drug war, but he had also been given speeches, like in the US, where he had said, if we can't solve this thing, we have to look at alternatives, like hinting he was in favor of legalization. And I knew he'd been a student of the Milton Friedman, the libertarian economist viewpoint, right? And, some of his people had given a speech at some low-level conference. And I look at Calderon and I said, so when you guys did this, you gave the speech, were you trying to stimulate a conversation on legalization? And Calderon says to me, of course. And what was interesting with Calderon was, he, on a conceptual level, supported drug legalization. But he goes, how is that going to help me tomorrow? I have a drug war on my hands, and what can you tell me that helps me with the drug war right now? And the truth was, I didn't have that much to suggest to him. I mean, I suggested opening up the dialogue. I did suggest to him that he begin to use the phraseology of prohibition, to start talking, and I had been doing this in the United States for 20 years, to talk not just about the drug war and the problems of the drug war, but to talk about the problems of drug prohibition, right? And at one point, Calderon were arguing or yelling at one another. I mean, it was a very interesting meeting, right? And then I go down to Guatemala, and the Guatemalan president, I'm meeting with people there, and I end up getting the Guatemalan president calls me into his presidential palace, and I have a sit down just with him and the vice president and a couple members of Congress and business leaders, and brainstorming with him about how do you open up this dialogue, right? And meanwhile, I knew that in Colombia, Santos was sympathetic, and there was going to be a meeting of one of the summits, the Summit of the Americas, happening in Mexico, in Colombia. And so there's this very exciting moment. In fact, Jonas, I'll send you the piece I wrote, and you can where all of a sudden you have this excitement happening in Latin America at the elite level about, legalization. And, Santos is seeing how far he can push it. Otto Perez is looking at it. Calderon is just doing his stupid drug war and counterproductive drug war. But I know in the back of his head, he knows that that's doomed. And meanwhile, he knows that some level of legalization is the right answer. And meanwhile, the Global Commission is active. And so you have this elite-driven effort beginning to really move forward. And there's this moment of real excitement 10 years ago that something had happened. Then there's the Summit of the Americas, and Otto Perez is talking to other Central American leaders. And, and there's a lot of excitement about this stuff. And ultimately, unfortunately, and then meanwhile, the other thing that happens is the United States, after we legalize marijuana, in November of 2012, the Obama administration is asking itself, what do we do now? Because 2 states have just voted to legalize marijuana, but technically it's all illegal under federal law and international law. And they don't know what to do. And finally, in the summer of 2013, they announced, you know what? We're going to allow it to proceed if Colorado and Washington can prove that legally regulating marijuana better advances the health and safety objectives of federal drug law than does continuing with a failed prohibitionist policy. And then the very influential key U.S. diplomat, I was saying Brownfield, I think his name was, he announces a new U.S. foreign policy doctrine, right, on drug policy. Whereas before the U.S. had been the leader of the global drug war almost for the entire century and really pressing for a very militaristic, punitive drug policy, all of a sudden the U.S. now says is, hey, don't screw around with the conventions, but we now support other countries experimenting with different models, and we will be tolerant of those approaches. And meanwhile, in Uruguay, Mujica is leading the government towards becoming the first country in the world to legalize marijuana at the national level, which Uruguay does in December 2013. So there's this moment of real excitement, right? And then all of this is leading up to a United Nations meeting in 2016, a United Nations General Assembly, where Calderon, basically goes, and I don't know whether it's because I suggested it to him or whether he just did it on his own, he becomes the first president, even as he's leading this stupid ass drug war. At the same time, he stands up in the United Nations and talks about the problems of drug prohibition. And to my knowledge, becomes the first president ever to speak at the United Nations and use the phrase drug prohibition and lay out a frame. And meanwhile, even though his government is not being very supportive, interestingly, in the older years, it was typically, you would get support for drug policy in some ministries in the government, and oftentimes more political ones. But that foreign ministries, right, were typically the most conservative because they didn't deal with drugs, they didn't know anything. But interestingly, at that moment, the Mexican foreign ministry is very supportive of drug policy reform. And the Guatemalan foreign ministry, and also the Jamaican foreign ministry, and the Uruguayan foreign ministry. So we had a little coalition that was mobilizing the United Nations to try to open up some space for a broader global dialogue, being led essentially by the foreign ministries of your country, of Mexico and some others, with some levels of support from their presidents, right? So it was an exciting moment happening there, right? Now, unfortunately, this did open some space. It did lead to some innovative things happening at the global level, but ultimately could only go so far. And then, of course, what happens is, Peña Nieto comes in and, he doesn't really care about this stuff. And Santos eventually is replaced by somebody who's not that sympathetic. And Otto Perez Molina gets caught up in some corruption, and he lands up going to jail. And so that dies down. And then Mujica is replaced by somebody else who, so you had a dynamic leadership that begins to fade there. And then the US, Obama is replaced with Trump. And we're all scared it's going to roll back dramatically. Fortunately, only rolls back a little bit. And that's when you have really the favorable emergence, on the medical marijuana issue. On the bigger issues around legalization, there's no popular support in Latin America or the US, right? There's support for, not having, airplanes spraying, poisonous chemicals on crops, right? But what you have happen in Mexico and Colombia, right, is you have the emergence of the medical marijuana issue. I remember talking with Lisa Sanchez, who's one of the leading Mexican activists, and she's, running things at, Armando Santa Cruz's, MUCAD organization. And, she's lobbying, she's calling people in the government, and very hard to get her phone calls returned. But then these stories show up in Mexico. Same thing happened in Colombia. These incredibly compassionate stories about some baby who has a terrible, epileptic condition, where the only thing that will help will be medical marijuana. I mean, do you guys remember what the name of the baby was? It became a whole campaign.
Her name is Grace, but she's not really
Grace.
a baby. I think she's like 4 or 5 at the time.
4 or 5. So Grace, and Grace, all of a sudden, all the media are talking about Grace, the medical benefits of cannabis, and you see this transition in public opinion happening around the marijuana issue. And now it's not just at the elite levels, it's happening at the local level as well. And the same thing happening in Colombia. And then it begins to happen in Brazil, right? And you see the medical marijuana issue beginning to play a role in Latin America, like we had seen it play in the United States, and beginning to transform the conversation around cannabis in a way so that now in Mexico, you can have a lively, it seems like your Mexican Congress has been talking about legalization of cannabis now for years, and they just can't seem to get it done. And it's being driven by the courts, but there's some growing public support for it. You see Colombia, I haven't been following the news, but Colombia may vote to legalize marijuana today or tonight or tomorrow, and you see momentum happening there. You see medical marijuana being legalized around Latin America, and I've left out Africa and Asia and the rest of the world, right? But you see similar things happening there. I mean, in Africa, you now have 10 or 12 countries that have voted to legalize marijuana. You have the presidents of Zimbabwe and Botswana talking about the need to transition from a tobacco economy to a cannabis economy, right? You have Thailand actually sort of legalizing marijuana earlier this year, or at the end of last year, and now it may roll back. You have medical marijuana legislation being adopted in most of the Asian countries. Even in the Philippines with Duterte and the drug war, you're seeing growing support for this sort of stuff, right? So you're seeing these little issues beginning to move forward again, right, in ways that are surprising people. So it's hard to be optimistic, and about all of this. But what you see is that the cannabis issue and cannabis reform is moving forward in Latin America and other parts of the world in ways which are helping to transform the broader discussion and the broader dialogue, right? Now, none of this is going to help solve the bigger problems around the narcos and the narco corruption, all of that stuff. So I'll just finish by saying, when it comes to what does one do about that issue, around the power of the narcos, especially in Mexico, but also in other countries around the world. And I mean, look, ultimately, the only way to effectively deal with this stuff is going to be from some form of legal regulation, right? It means the United States, where we have a terrible problem with people dying from fatal overdose involving fentanyl, and with that fentanyl coming from China and sometimes from China through Mexico, or now being produced in Mexico to the U.S. You understand the United States, over 100,000 people died last year of an overdose. That's more people than all the people in the United States who died in car accidents, and all the people in the United States who died from guns, whether homicide or suicide or accidents. All the car accidents, deaths, and all the gun deaths are barely 75% of the total number of overdose fatalities. So this is a major calamity in the United States. And a law enforcement approach is totally futile. The notion that it's possible to stop this from coming out of China or Mexico, when you're talking about drugs that are infinitesimal in their size, is ludicrous, right? But the problem is, it's not just that the Republicans, see an opportunity to revive the drug war by talking about fentanyl and beating up on Mexico and calling for tougher penalties in the United States. It's that even the Democrats, who know better, who know that it's ridiculous, feel that they need to sign on to this also, because the public, once again, the American public does not want to believe that the borders are out of control. They want to believe that somehow you can control this. And if it's out of control, put the cops in charge. So it's almost as if we spent 20, 30 years educating Americans to embrace more enlightened, evidence-based drug policy. And then a new drug like fentanyl comes around. That's the worst drug ever to hit America in terms of the likelihood of fatality. And people just retreat from the part of their brain which is thinking and the part of their heart which is compassionate, and go back to the fear-based part, which is crack down, be tough, support politicians who want to be tough, right? So, I mean, you know, when you see all this stupid shit between, you know, all the crazy shit that AMLO is saying now and the fentanyl thing and all this, I mean, that is totally not helpful. But meanwhile, you know, Biden, you know, is saying stupid shit too, in part because he was a drug warrior for most of his life until a few years ago, in part because he's afraid to say anything pragmatic because he knows that the public will not get it. So it's a very difficult issue, but ultimately, the only way to deal with that issue is to create ways where the people who are determined to use fentanyl and other illegal drugs will get their drugs from a legal source rather than from going to the illegal market. That's where it's good to look at what's happening in British Columbia, Vancouver, British Columbia, western part of Canada, where they have an approach that's called safe supply. And safe supply is about trying to find ways to persuade illegal drug users who refuse to go to treatment, who refuse to stop, and yet, you know, sending them to prison will only not really solve the problem. It's about trying to persuade them to get the drugs they want from legal sources rather than illegal. It's taking the model that Switzerland pioneered in Europe 30 years ago, and that other countries like Germany and Denmark and the Netherlands and now Canada and now Denmark and others have copied. It's about where they allow people who are using heroin that they purchase illegally to instead go to a clinic where they can get pharmaceutical heroin. It's the only thing that will work ultimately is radical policies like that, combined with all the other kind of pragmatic health-based policies that one needs. So, you know, I'll say, you know, 6 years ago, I stopped, you know, being involved in this full time. I pay attention to this issue. You know, I feel some optimism about where this is going. But, you know, I knew it from the beginning that this is a multi-generational struggle. And we're now in the second generation of what will be a 3-generation or maybe longer struggle, you know, to ground drug policies in science, compassion, health, and human rights. You know, my hope is that some of you will find the motivation and the ability to commit either part or all of your lives, at least for some time, to this movement. It is one of the great human rights movements out there today. And it's a human rights movement that's about changing minds and policies and hearts and legislation. I can tell you, you know, having been involved in this in a major way and in a leadership role for decades, that, you know, it's a beautiful movement. I mean, the people who come to this, people don't get involved in this movement because they want money or power, right? Or all the conventional rewards. They come into it because they want to fight for freedom and for justice and rational public policy. Ultimately, that's what this is about. And I'll stop now and I'll take your questions.
Thank you so much, Ethan. Are there any questions? Either you can put them or ask them in English or in Spanish in the chat, or raise your hand and I'll call on the people. Sí, si tienen alguna pregunta o un comentario para Ethan, lo pueden poner en el chat o levantan la mano en Zoom y pueden preguntar en español o inglés. Y si es en español, yo lo puedo traducir como quieran. So if no one has any questions, then I'll ask my question.
Okay, Jonas.
No, Eugenio, en la mano levantada.
Sí, ¿ahí me escucho bien?
Sí.
Excelente. So thank you, Ethan. It's a pleasure for me to be talking with you in here. I know this is going to be a core memory in the future. So I have two questions. Since you have experience from the beginning, this prohibition drug policy till now, in the actual times that things are quite different, how do you see the international drug policy in the following 10 to 20 years? Do you believe that things are going to change and are going to be very different from now, or do you think that things are going to go like slowly changing in time?
Well, it's a very good question, Eugenio. I think with marijuana, it's going to keep moving forward, right? And if you think about it, marijuana does not, I mean, most of the people who are locked up on drug charges are for other drugs, heroin, cocaine, methamphetamine, fentanyl, what have you. But marijuana accounts for a majority of all the drug arrests around the world, not just in my country, right? So that will be a major breakthrough, I think, with respect to marijuana, and it will help loosen up broader attitudes. I think, secondly, I think that what we call the psychedelic renaissance, which I did not talk about, but this amazing explosion of scientific research showing the medical benefits of psychedelics, you know, of mescaline and of psilocybin and of ibogaine and of others is extraordinary. I mean, you know, right now, if you look at the major universities in the United States, Harvard and Yale and Columbia and Johns Hopkins and University of California and Baylor in Texas and many other major universities and medical centers and University College in London and universities in Switzerland and in Brazil and other places, all of them have research centers devoted to the study of psychedelics, right? Funded typically by private entrepreneurs with private money, because the US government has been very slow to fund this research, although that's beginning to change. That psychedelics renaissance, and meanwhile, you also see now in the United States, you have these ballot initiatives like in Oregon and Colorado to legalize or decriminalize psychedelics use. So you have a sort of revolution in psychedelics. Next week, this Sunday, I'm going to Denver. There's going to be a psychedelics conference organized by the organization called MAPS, M-A-P-S, Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. 10,000 people from all around the world have registered for that conference. This is far and away the largest gathering in the world, talking about the science, talking about the culture, about the business, about the research. It's extraordinary. And I think that is destined to keep moving forward as well, right? I think, thirdly, I think that more countries will keep moving in the direction of the decriminalization of drug possession, harm reduction. The approach that you have in Europe, the approach you have in Uruguay, the approach that also was enacted into law in Oregon. I think because the evidence shows that a policy which basically puts nobody in jail for simple drug possession and instead focuses on trying to help people get their lives together and still punishes drug dealers, you know, what they call the Portugal model, I think that approach will continue. I think also, you know, what happened 10 years ago is the United States stopped being the champion of the global war on drugs. We essentially handed the baton to the Russians, because the Russians, you know, are very pro-drug war. They have a very horrible, inhumane, punitive drug policy, really terrible, very anti-science. You know, you saw that when the United States began to become more moderate, you saw the head of the Russian Drug Control Agency going to Central America and talking to people. Oh, we'll help you. You know, we're still drug warriors. You know, we'll help train your drug cops. So, but I think that the delegitimation of Russia in global politics and for the foreseeable future means that the most powerful force supporting the drug war is no longer as effective. Now, a big question is going to be about China, because China, you know, is going to be a continuing growing power in global politics. China does have methadone programs. They do have needle exchange programs, but it's within the context of a very punitive environment, right? And you see that when Duterte, the former president of Philippines, launched his drug war, that other countries, more authoritarian leaders in Indonesia, Malaysia, began to cheer him on, right? So we see that there's support for that approach, yet at the same time, you also see in Malaysia a movement for decriminalization. You see in the new government of Philippines a growing openness again to harm reduction, right? You see in Africa, I think, a growing recognition, for some movement towards more moderate drug policies. So overall, I think we're going to see in marijuana and psychedelics a major change. I think you're going to see with the other drugs, I think it's going to go back and forth, where it will be mostly 3 or 4 steps forward and 2 or 3 steps backwards. And in some countries it'll roll back, especially under authoritarian leaders. But I think even with marijuana and even with psychedelics, sometimes even the authoritarian leaders will be supportive of that because they see marijuana making money and paying taxes because it can be legally regulated. And with psychedelics, I mean, even in America, some of the most impressive laws are being passed with the support of Republicans and with conservative rich people. I mean, it's mostly on the left, but there's some support on the right. So I feel, and I think that openness on marijuana and psychedelics inevitably will cause people to think in more innovative ways with the other drugs as well.
Thank you.
There's a question from Jessica in the chat that says, what do you consider are the approaches or new narratives that are necessary to address right now other than harm reduction or drug regulation regarding drug policy?
I think apart from, obviously, harm reduction is pivotal. One way I define harm reduction, there are various ways. One way, is a policy definition, is to say it's any intervention in policy that seeks to reduce the negative consequences of both drug use and the negative consequences of drug prohibitionist policies. Another way to think about harm reduction, it's the place where public health and human rights intersects. It's that intersection between public health and human rights, right? Now, and when it comes to drug regulation, we're talking about obviously legal regulation of marijuana and psychedelics and maybe the safe supply model. I think the other place is people need to keep being reminded of the failures and the costs and the consequences of prohibitionist policies. They need to keep being reminded that the power of the narcos stems to some good extent from a failed prohibitionist policy, just like Al Capone during alcohol prohibition. They need to keep being reminded that a prohibitionist policy cannot succeed in any democratic society and doesn't even work very well in non-democratic societies. So we need to keep ramming that message home, right, about the futility and the costliness and the counterproductiveness of that strategy. We had 20, 30 years of putting this message out there, but we need to keep putting that message out there again. And again, and again, and again.
Yeah, and I think it's especially important, right? Like in the context of cannabis regulation, for example, where there's all this kind of, this detail or that detail doesn't work out necessarily as anticipated or intended. But what's the alternative? And what came before?
Yeah, I mean, inevitably, regulation is very messy. And when people are frustrated with the way the regulation of cannabis is evolving, you just need to keep comparing to alternative. I remember sometimes people in Mexico would say to me, well, you talk about responsible regulation instead of prohibition, Ethan. I mean, in the US, you can do responsible regulation. In Mexico, we have no chance to do responsible regulation. And my response to that is, hey, if you have a choice between an ineffective prohibitionist policy or an ineffective regulatory policy, which one is less bad? And you know what? An ineffective regulatory policy is less bad than an ineffective prohibitionist policy, because at least you're getting tax regulation, tax money. At least people are trying to regulate. At least you're not filling the prisons. You know, at least the profits of the narcos will not be as big. So, yeah.
There was a hand up from, había una mano de Rachel. No sé si todavía quieres preguntar, porque ya no veo la mano. So there was a hand up, but it has disappeared now. Okay, Ricardo, entonces. Adelante.
Hi, Ethan. This is Ricardo from Colombia. Thank you for your speech. I'm gonna try to propose this question. I don't know if it's pertinent, perhaps, but a few months ago I was watching Breaking Bad for the second time because Better Call Saul was airing the last season, and I was excited about it. I think it's a really good and well-written piece of fiction. But afterwards, and in this last month, I was asking myself if the public, if the general public is watching culture, if is feeling through fiction this new perspective of the war on drugs, or if we are still, and the United States are still obsessed and fascinated with this narco narrative, and somehow keeping it, like having this old view of the war on drugs. Yeah. Through fiction. I don't know if you're seeing.
Sure, it's a good question, Ricardo. So a few things about that. So far as I can tell, the TV shows like Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul, which I too think are incredibly well written, and perhaps the best cinematography of any television show ever made in America, or The Wired, which was a famous TV show about Baltimore by David Simon, which is a real classic as well and focuses on the drug trade. I think they're incredibly helpful and valuable. I have not watched all the series, the Narcos series, you know, the ones out of Mexico and Colombia. I don't know if there was one in the US. I don't know. My basic sense is this, well, the first one is I don't think that those television programs like Breaking Bad, Better Call Saul, I don't think that they increase support for the drug war. I think people see a sense of a drama. They also realize how impossible the futility of the drug war. They realize that even when you get rid of the major narcos, they're just replaced with somebody else. They realize you cannot stop the drugs at the border. So I don't think that those dramas hurt. I don't know if they helped, but I'm pretty sure they did not hurt. So that's first. I think secondly, what happened with the media is back in the 1980s and 90s, I mean, it was almost impossible to turn on the television without seeing, TV shows of, reporters following police, breaking down doors, arresting people, resting their hands, all of this stuff. I mean, they were kind of glorified, war movies, but about a domestic war in the United States, right? And I think what happened was at some point, people got tired of that stuff. And also there was some resistance to that stuff. I mean, they got tired of it. They began to see it as silly. People began to protest the fact, how often it was showing cops, arresting Black and brown people. So, I mean, I don't watch very much TV, but I think there's a lot less about it. And I think there's a lot more cynicism. The press conferences where the police and the prosecutor pile the drugs and the money on top of a table to say, look how much we seized. I think more and more people go like, really? you know, so that's going to make a difference. I just think there's a cynicism that's out there and people still do it, but, you know, it's just not as persuasive. Now, interestingly, I do think that the media, the entertainment media, has played a very important role, and especially on the marijuana issue. You know, after we won the first medical marijuana initiative in California in '96, and then when we won 6 more in the other states between 1998 and 2000, we got most of the reporting, the news reporting was very good. And when I and other people would go on TV to debate the issue, you know, the drug warriors, they did not even want to debate us. I mean, to argue the other side against medical marijuana, you know, I mean, they were almost embarrassed. But interestingly, what happened was the entertainment media, right? That virtually every television show, both the comedies and the dramas in the late 1990s, began to have a medical marijuana story that they would either have for laughs or for tears. And it really helped to transform the discussion, around this stuff. You know, and I would tell you, I remember I would be down in Brazil or in Mexico or in Colombia, and I would be talking to people in the media.
Bueno, se cayó otra vez. A ver si regresa.
Sí, se le pausa.
The Mexican president, who runs the third TV station there, in Mexico. And I would say to him is that what you need is, you know, so much of your country watches these telenovelas, right? And this was a few years ago, before you had the stories with Grace and the others. And I would say, here's what you need to do. In your telenovelas, you need to take one of the most beloved characters, you know, the beloved abuela, you know, the beloved grandmother, right? And write a narrative through multiple episodes where she gets, say, breast cancer. And then she needs to have chemotherapy, right? And she's nauseous and she cannot eat. And her children say, abuela, you know, you should try this marijuana. She goes, no, you know, she's Catholic, she's traditional, evangelical. I don't touch that. That's immoral. No. And eventually, the abuela, she smokes the joint. And you see the pain fade from her face. And you see the nausea subside. And you see her smile. And she goes, this? And I said, if you did a story like that in a telenovela, you could move millions of people over on this issue, right? Now, all of them loved it. When I talk to people at television, and the other one I forget the name of, you know, they all loved the idea. In Mexico, Colombia, you know, Brazil, other countries. I don't know if anybody ever did it. I don't know if they ever did it. Now, in the end, the opinion changed anyway, you know, in most of these countries. But the entertainment, and we did nothing. Like, I was not sitting down, and my colleagues were not sitting down with the screenwriters to say, you should do this. They were just doing it on their own, right? Or there was a movie called Traffic 20 years ago with Michael Douglas and Catherine Zeta-Jones, where Michael Douglas plays the drug czar. And I actually was involved also in talking to the screenwriter and the people in that movie. And that movie was very effective in showing the futility of the drug war. But they did not show the horrible negative consequences of the drug war, right? So they didn't do the show about that. But I actually think that in the last 15, 20 years, the entertainment media has been more of a positive factor than a negative factor. I can't believe how many TV shows I turn on now, very popular TV shows in the United States. Like, some of the most popular ones right now, there's a show Succession, and another show called Ted Lasso, and some other shows. And every single show is having jokes and other things about ayahuasca or peyote or something like this. And it's all about loosening up attitudes and increasing curiosity and normalizing the use of these things, right? So I think the entertainment media is overwhelmingly playing a more constructive role. There's some still bad stuff there, but I think overall it's a net positive.
Thank you.
So unfortunately, we have run out of time, and especially lo siento, Rachel, que teníamos la mano arriba. But we have run out of time, so there's no more time for questions because we're about to start the next session. And to give you guys a small break after these 2 hours.
Wow, Jonas, you're having a session on a Friday night this late? I thought I would be the last one trying to keep you awake at 6 p.m. But wow, okay.
But it's only 6 p.m. here for us now, so.
I know, that's dedication for you. Yeah, but still, Friday night, going until, well, God bless.
Thanks so much. Thank you so much for sharing your experience, your insights. Again, Ethan is probably one of the most knowledgeable and most directly involved people. For example, I think I glimpsed from your travel account that you might be responsible for the 2016 UNGAS then, because that was actually called for by the Mexican, Guatemalan, and Colombian president. And if you were on a little trip of trying to get to talk to people, you might have had a role in that. So let's give a round of applause for Ethan. Thank you so much.
Wonderful to join you all. Jonas, thanks for inviting me. Good luck. I'll send you that piece I mentioned earlier. I encourage you to watch my TED Talk. I think you'll enjoy it. And enjoy the next session and your weekend.
Thank you very much, Ethan.
Check out Ethan's podcast, Psychoactive.
Yeah.
It's very good. It's on all things about drugs, talking to very interesting people. So if you listen to podcasts, put it on your list.
Yeah,
I think
and I'm sorry I couldn't join you. You know, I was down in Aguascalientes a couple months before the pandemic and gave a speech back then, you know, when Alejandro and Catalina invited me. So I'm sorry I was not able to join you. But listen to the podcast. It's all about drugs. There are some episodes about Latin America, including with former Colombian President Santos and with Alejandro Madrazo and Catalina Perez. And so I think you'll enjoy it. Okay, take care.
Thank you. Bye.
The proper transmission, we got the plug-in.
Very good, Jonas. Okay.
Thank you all. And
okay, bye-bye.
we're going to close this session, and we'll see you in the second session with